Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is Mrs. Simmons. I am here to talk about the Greek tragedy, understanding that ancient culture, their theater, so that we can apply it to what we will read, Oedipus the King, but also how Shakespeare pulled inspiration from that work. So, let's go ahead and get started. The first thing we need to talk about is the author. The author of Oedipus the King is Sophocles. He's one of the most famous playwrights of Greek tragedy. He's one of the three pinnacles of Greek tragedy, but he's not the creator of Greek tragedy. Aristotle actually defined it in his Poetics. Sophocles was born near Athens in 496 BCE-ish. He was born in the town of Colonus. Lived to be 90-ish. He witnessed much of the Greek Golden Age, the high point of that culture, and he also lived during the Persian Wars, and the Greeks did triumph in that, so it helped lend itself to the Greek Golden Age. Something else that you need to understand is the theater of Dionysus. This is really the starting point for any sort of Greek tragedy. I have a YouTube video linked here. It's also down below from my video. I would suggest that you watch it. It just gives you some background information on the theater itself, the history to it. Now, I do want to say a few things about the theater, though. It was built in the 6th century BCE in Athens. It's the theater that almost all classical plays were first performed. That includes Oedipus the King, Antigone, things like that. It started out as a roughed-out theater, but eventually was carved into the mountainside with stone seating that could hold up to 17,000 people and a stone stage, and it had pretty good acoustics. It was a part of a larger area, kind of like a church, like a campus there, tied to the worship of the god Dionysus. That god's focus was wine, merriment, and theater. The comedies and tragedies were later added to the yearly festival in March and April. This is an aerial view of the Theater of Dionysus. You can see how it looks an awful lot like our auditoriums. We have seating up here, the orchestra here, and then the rest of the campus where sacrifices were made and people worshipped. So, a few other elements of Greek tragedy. One of the key concepts that you need to understand about Greek tragedies, because they will play a role in our reading of Oedipus the King, is the chorus. So this picture here seems a little creepy, but it's an example of what the chorus may have looked like at that time. Masks were important. So throughout a tragedy, the chorus, which was a masked group of 12 to 15 actors, observe and comment on the action, and they do this through songs that have names like Parotos and Exodos. Their responses, so the way they respond to the action, and the values that they hold, reflected those of the audience, so the Athenians, the Greeks, and the community of the play, and in this case it's Thebes, so the Theban people. Now, the leader, the choragus, participated in the dialogue, so this one character could come forward and actually interact with the other actors on stage. So let's talk about the actors on stage. In contrast with the chorus of 12 or 15, there were only 3 actors in 5th century Athenian tragedy. The original word for actor was hypocrites, probably not pronounced that way, but it meant answerer, or one who interprets, for the actor always answered the chorus. The chorus would pose a question or say something to them, and then they would respond. Thespis is said to have introduced and been the first actor in 520 BCE, which was later called the protagonistes, literally the first competitor, and this is where we get the word protagonist, which is interesting. The introduction of a second actor, the deuteragonistes, is attributed to Aeschylus, and the third, the tritagonistes, to Sophocles, who's the author of our play. So let's get into the actual Greek tragedy itself, the information that you need to understand there. So tragedy is a form of drama that shows the downfall of a dignified, superior character who participates in events of great significance. So we're dealing with someone who is of high rank and who has sway in their community. They could be a ruler, or they could just be somebody who has a lot of power. The ancient Greeks, who developed this concept of a tragedy, used it to really explore ideas about humans' relationships to the gods. You have to remember that this was first presented at a festival for a Greek god, so how humans related to the gods that they worshipped at the time. And it often delved into serious subjects such as duty and suffering and fate and how those affect who we are as people. Now, we need to talk a little bit about catharsis as well. We hear this thrown around a lot in a modern world, but I don't think it's quite understood the way that it needs to be understood. So, Greek tragedies were a religious experience. They were meant as a religious purification for the crowd. So audiences were expected to respond to these dramas with a sense of pity and divine justice. Pity for the character and justice for what the gods believed were right. So this purification or release of the viewer's emotions was a vicarious experience. They got to experience through the character, the main character, the protagonist, the tragic hero, and hopefully learn from that experience. So some more elements of Greek tragedy that we need to know is the tragic hero. Now you've probably heard this term before, you've probably studied the tragic hero before, but we're going to look at the Greek classic tragic hero here. So this is, of course, a person of high rank. And this character undergoes great pain and suffering due to their flaw or their mistake. Yet, they accept his or her downfall with dignity. Now, this is kind of a broad definition, so we need to go a little more detailed into what a tragic hero is. The first thing we do need to understand, though, is that they tend to be an archetype. Now, we've already studied archetypes. This is something that shows up even today in characters and in stories, plays, novels, whatever. So it's a model from which similar heroes have been copied for centuries in mythic, traditional, and classical literature. We are studying the very classic Greek tragic hero. We will be studying how that was morphed into the Shakespearean and Renaissance tragic. First thing we have to understand about a tragic hero is that they have a tragic flaw. This is often in Greek literature considered the hamartia. Now, hamartia is truly just an error in judgment or a weakness in a character. So they make a poor choice or they have a character flaw such as pride or arrogance that brings about the hero's downfall, their pain, and their suffering. Now, I want to note something really significant here. Not all Greek tragic heroes are trapped because of their sin. Some fall because they are trapped irrevocably in a situation. So we have to understand that because this was a way for the Greeks to understand their role with the gods, sometimes the gods made decisions that they had to try and figure out. So it wasn't always their fault, the tragic hero's fault. Sometimes it was simply a situation they were put into by the gods. Now, the important thing about hamartia is that the hero recognizes it and its consequences, but it's always a little bit too late. This is a critical discovery, and that recognition of the consequences and where they are is called anagnorisis. That's an important term to know. Now, the hero's tragic flaw tends to be one particular thing, so their hamartia tends to be hubris. Hubris is the typical flaw. It is excessive pride toward or defiance of the gods. So, gods, you think you know what's right, but no, I think I do things very much. Now, this pride leads to nemesis, another Greek term. Now, this is the complete downfall. This typically has the tragic heroes accepting their downfall with dignity. And the etymology here, so the history behind this word is nemin, which literally means to give what is due. Additionally, Nemesis was the goddess of vengeance or divine wrath. So in the scheme of a tragedy, it makes a lot of sense that Nemesis would be tied to their goddess, vengeance and divine wrath. This character has done something they shouldn't have done or have been put in a difficult situation, and they have to deal with the consequences of their actions or the situation. Additionally, we have some concepts of fate floating around in Greek tragedy, and we'll see this a lot in Oedipus the King. The ancient Greeks believed heavily in fate, or a destiny that was preordained by the gods. No matter what action you took, that's the way it was supposed to be. It was literally impossible to escape one's fate. When you thought, I'm going to take the left road, no, I'm going to take the right one, well, it doesn't matter. The fates had already decided you were going to take the right path. So, it's important for us to understand this desire for fate and this understanding of fate as the Greeks knew it. Now, the Fates, also known as the Moirai, were the three goddesses who determined the length of a person's life and how much suffering it would contain. These characters, the Fates, are actually from Hercules, if you've seen the Disney film. The women that were going around cutting the hair, they were the Fates in that movie. So now we need to talk about the basic plot of Greek tragedies. This is really intriguing to me. There are some more Greek terms here, but there's also just some really intriguing ideas behind how they built their plot. So Greek plots must have unity. All events lead to the next and the inevitable end. There's no deus ex machina, which means there's no hand of God walking in and stumbling in and saying, oh, you know, I actually want it to happen this way. Everything builds on itself. So the first thing that we have is the exposition, as always. So it gives any background information that is needed, such as who are the characters, their rank, what they're like, the setting, all of those things. Second, we have the inciting incident. This is a single moment which sets the entire story in motion. So without this moment, the story itself just simply wouldn't exist. We have to have that inciting incident. The next thing is the rising action. So the conflict here is complicated. Secondary conflicts might be introduced and developed, but they always, always, always develop the main conflict of the play. The fourth thing we have is what we call a reversal, or the Greek term peripeteia. So this occurs when a situation seems to develop in one direction, but suddenly it reverses to another, or when a character produces an effect opposite to that which he intended to produce. So think in Antigone, you've read that before. In Antigone, Creon intends that he will do what's right by the gods, but in fact it has the opposite effect and leads to the death of his son and his niece, Antigone. So according to Aristotle, the change of fortune for the hero should be an event that occurs contrary to the audience's expectations, so something that's opposite of what we expect, and that is therefore surprising, but that nonetheless appears as a necessary outcome of the preceding action. So even though it might surprise you, it makes a lot of sense that that's actually what ended up happening. The fifth thing is recognition. I've already mentioned this, but the Greek term is anagnorisis, which means knowing again, knowing back, or literally knowing throughout. So this is a change from ignorance to awareness, usually to an understanding of the gods' expectations. If we know that the tragic hero is doing something that the gods wouldn't have liked, they finally realize, oh, I shouldn't have done that. So recognition scenes in tragedy are of some horrible event or secret. Either something happens and they recognize that this is their fault, or a secret is revealed to them that's really terrible and helps them recognize why these things are happening to them. This recognition also means that the protagonist comes to understand his place in the grand scheme of the whole world. His scheme with his place with the gods, his place in his community, things of that nature. The sixth thing is the suffering or catastrophe. This has to do with pathos, so there's a lot of emotion happening in this sixth section. It's also translated as a calamity. So this element of plot is a destructive or painful act. In Antigone, it's ultimately the death of Haman and Antigone. This is the inevitable outcome of those preceding events. The English words sympathy, empathy, and apathy, literally the absence of suffering, all stem from this Greek word, pathos. A few other key elements, these are the ones that I find really interesting. The first thing is place. The setting is always in one place. Additionally, time. The play takes place literally in one day, sunrise to sunset. The action, I've already mentioned this, but all events in the play should develop the plot and the tragedy. There are no side stories. And the last thing is violence. Greek tragedies never actually depicted violence on stage, which is rather interesting. So what's the point of this whole tragic story that the Greeks have developed? Well, I've mentioned it before, I'm going to say it again. This catharsis is crazy important. This is a plot with tragic reversals, recognitions, and catastrophes, and it best arouses pity and fear in the very end. Pity for the character, man, this guy went through some really bad things and I feel bad for him, and fear of the gods. The gods control our lives and we have to respect and worship them. As I've said, this is the purgation of emotions, really going through and understanding the pain and suffering that you could experience, that you've seen others experience through this play. So here are my references if you want to check them out. I want to say thanks for listening. I hope this was useful to you. Make sure you come prepared with your notes and discussion, and for discussion when we return to class. Have a good day.